Hello everyone, my name's Claire Aby, and today I'm going to be talking to you about this book, Innocence and Victimhood, Gender, Nation, and Women's Activism in Postwar Bosnia-Herzegovina. A little information about me: I am a second-year pre-nursing student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I am currently enrolled in a cultural anthropology class, and this video is part of the World Ethnography Project. I'm taking this class because I would like to learn how to relate to people across all sorts of cultures so I can provide better care for my patients in the future. And this class has definitely helped me to do that. So that being said, let's get into the book. What happens to the victims of war? What happens when their victimhood is used against them? And most importantly, what happens when those victims take back their own victimhood as a position of power? These are the questions posed by Innocence and Victimhood, Gender, Nation, and Women's Activism in Post-War Bosnia-Herzegovina. Innocence and Victimhood was written by Elisa Helms. Helms is an associate professor in the Department of Gender Studies at Central European University in Vienna, Austria. Most of her work focuses on Central and Eastern Europe, focusing specifically on former Yugoslavia and on Bosnia-Herzegovina. She has mainly written about gender and nationalism, gender and ethnic violence, and focuses on societies that are either post-socialist or post-conflict. Innocence and Victimhood focuses on the war that took place in Bosnia-Herzegovina from 1992 to 1995, as well as on the activism and changes that took place within the country in the years that followed. It was published in 2013 by the University of Wisconsin. In the shadow of former Yugoslavia, the civil war erupted when people's differing ideas of nationality and religion clashed. As in every civil war, it was the women and children caught in the crossfire that suffered the most, particularly the Muslim Bosniak women. Over the course of the war, they were subjected to ethnic cleansing and to mass rapes. And in the years that followed, for reasons both religious and political, women were still seen as weaker and less capable. In some cases, they were even blamed for the war itself. However, through years of activism, these women were able to reclaim their victimhood in an affirmative way, and to obtain their own form of justice. The first chapter explores how the shifting gender roles and expectations in the decades leading up to the war helped to set in motion the events seen during it. The Civil War took place right after the fall of the Soviet Union and the disbandment of Yugoslavia. This created many smaller and increasingly unstable nations. While under Soviet rule, there was a large-scale movement to increase women's rights. However, not all women saw these new promises become a reality. For many Muslim women in rural communities, life did not change at all. As Yugoslavia was disbanded, a strong sense of nationalism was born into many individuals. This nationalism also retained many values of the Islamic faith. Women are seen as passive and helpless, while men are seen as leaders, and more importantly, as protectors. Therefore, the ultimate sign of the defeat of a nation was the desecration of its women. As a result, the rapes became a symbol of innocence and victimhood for the Bosniaks, and a symbol of barbarity for the Serbs. As Helm states on page 26 of her ethnography, the nation was cast as a woman in need of protection from our men, while the rape of their women signaled the defeat of their men, as they had not done enough to protect their women. Chapter 2 focuses on the decades leading up to the war, when there was a significant push for equality between men and women. At this time, women could vote and run for office, own and inherit property, and had access to educational and employment opportunities. For the first time, divorce became an option for many, and abortion was made legal in 1952. In 1950, the wearing of a religious garment with the purpose of hiding a woman's face and body was banned. Many of these changes did not reach the women in rural communities. They were often left at home while the men traveled to the factories for work. While there was a mandate requiring that every child attend at least 8 years of school, most girls would only attend up to the 4th grade, stopping their education at around 9 or 10. It was a belief of many that attending school beyond that age would distract a young girl from learning her importance of being a wife and a mother. It was also increasing the chance that a young girl would compromise her sexual reputation. The feelings that most Bosniaks had towards young girls in school is best summed up on page 50 of the ethnography. As an elderly Bosniak man who had educated his own daughters explained the early socialist period in his small town, a female going to school must be a whore. That's how it was. In the eastern part of the country, Serb forces traveled from town to town, leaving a trail of destruction and agony in their wake. They would rape the women and subject the men whom they did not kill to sexual abuse. In one small town, they even went as far as to kill the best male athletes at the high school to prevent the siring of strong soldiers in the future. Both the men and the women were often taken from their homes and forced into detention camps. While the men were humiliated and subjected to barbarian conditions, the women were made to suffer in different ways. The Serbs not only raped the young girls, but forced them to cook and clean for them, as well as forcing and selling many into sex slavery. Some were killed after being raped, and some were released as a living image of shame for themselves and their people. The ones who became pregnant were kept until their pregnancies had progressed too far along for an abortion to take place. These women and girls were told that the child growing inside of them would one day grow up to kill them. Helm sums up the function of rape in war on pages 56 and 57. The function of rape was to establish a particular ethnic geography, or the rape of women in ethnicized conflicts became a weapon by which cross-ethnic social ties and peaceful coexistence was brutally severed. Any further sharing of the same territory, now reinscribed as belonging to one ethnic group only, was made unthinkable. It was for this reason, and many more, that the Bosniak women are often seen as being the biggest victims of the war. For many Muslim women, rape is a greater punishment than death itself. In the Islamic faith, women are seen as symbols of purity and submission. The loss of that purity, often through force and submission, was crushing, especially for those who weren't yet married. And while many faith leaders told men not to see these women as any less for no longer being pure and encouraged them to still take them as their wives, the stigmas and scars, both mental and physical, remained. Chapter 3 focuses on the movements and developments after the war. After the war ended, non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, sprung up like mushrooms after a rain. Many were focused on women and helped to support women's activism. They helped to further support feminist ideals and practices, and most importantly, supported the women who had been directly affected by the war. Many of the women involved were young. The NGOs helped not only to support activism, but also pushed for cultural and social reform for all women in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Unfortunately, there were still many that did not like the idea of vocal women, let alone women who were vocal about politics. As a result, the only women who kept their voices were those who lived in cosmopolitan areas and had a support system built behind them. The movement was kept in motion, but many people who took part no longer saw themselves as activists. Chapter 4 focuses on the years directly after the war. The words nationalism and feminism both became words with strong negative connotations. After all, it was the feelings of nationalism that had brought about the war to begin with. It bred a disdain for those whose religious beliefs and way of living was different than the general population. Meanwhile, feminism was also painted in a negative light as it brought about even more differences between the two sides. It was stated that the women and not the men were the boldest ones after the war. They were the brave ones and the more practical ones. They were willing to meet with people on the other side of the table to get the job done. There was also a new idea brewing that women had started the war. While they had not been the ones behind the guns, they had raised the sons behind them. They had not taught their children tolerance, but instead had reinforced intolerance ideals. The post-war years also brought about conversations between the two ethnic groups. While the Serbs were continually portrayed as being the aggressors and the enemy, they too had lost many. Many women were now without husbands, and many children were without fathers. They were not given the same sympathy as the Bosniaks, but instead were expected to feel guilty for actions that had not been their own. One Serbian woman was quoted saying, "It hurts me a bit that you have asked us, maybe unconsciously, to admit guilt for 1992. We're victims too, not the killers that you portray us to be. If that were true, my children would have a father today." Chapter 5 focuses on politics. Many women who spoke with the author were quick to mention that she doesn't do politics or wasn't in politics the moment the word was mentioned. As Helm states, after all, politics is a whore. Men were legitimate actors, but the realm itself was female, a disreputable and immoral one. She enticed and corrupted men, compelling them to engage in immoral acts. Politicians themselves were cast as prostitutes, who sold themselves and their moral principles for personal gains. Even as more and more women entered the political scene, it was still seen as a place where women did not belong. Phrases such as, "we'd rather have a woman in office than you," were all too common. The women who did make it into politics were constantly scrutinized and questioned. The idea of a woman leaving the home seemed ludicrous, and this was an ideal that was consistently held across all career fields. Women in the work field missed work frequently to fulfill their duties as a wife or a mother. Meanwhile, if a man missed work, it was often for a casual or personal reason. Even as these absences for women decreased as their husbands took on more domestic chores, they were still left with no time for themselves and often were not given the same opportunities to advance themselves as their male counterparts. Towards the end of the 1990s and into the early 2000s, the push to get women into politics only became stronger. Many candidates ran under the premise that having a woman in office was the best way to address women's rights. Many pointed to the fact that women made better politicians due to their ability to relate to others and to their tamer, humbler political nature. Chapter 6 focuses on the actions taken to authenticate and acknowledge the victimhood of these women. The stigma around being raped resonates through a victim's life forever. As much as they want to blend back into their families and communities, many of these women may never fully be able to. Women took to the streets, literally and figuratively, as activists that sought out some form of justice. In 1998, a law on civilian war crimes was passed, and many of those who had been physically disabled by the war were able to receive pension. Those who had been psychologically scarred were not taken into account. Rape survivors became easier and easier to ignore. They had been silenced by their shame, and now they were silenced by the law. However, in 2006, a major victory was won, as activists pushed to include survivors of sexual violence in the Civilian Victims Law Amendment. They took special care to ensure that the amendment was worded in a way that no ethnicity or minority was excluded. This allowed for the long-awaited aid to be able to reach many more survivors, and also included the men that had suffered abuse. I now want to read an excerpt from this ethnography. I will be reading from the conclusion on page 247. To meaningfully chip away at power hierarchies like those based on gender or ethno-national ideologies requires the persistent dismantling of essentialist representations, the exposure of such ideologies at work in disguised forms, and attention to how other social categories are mobilized in the formation of social and political claims to morality and legitimacy. It also requires analytical attention to unstated implications that hide in zones of ambiguity created by the narrative of collective victimhood and how they produce moral claims to innocence. This ethnography really did make me stop and think. Just like Helm said it should. And if I'm being honest with you, it broke my heart in more ways than one. I cannot imagine the mental and the physical pain that these women went through, and I find it absolutely ludicrous that even after all of the events that occurred during the war, they were still made to feel like they were the ones at fault. But at the same time, this book makes me proud of women and proud to be a woman. It shows that anyone, regardless of race, sexuality, gender, or religion, with a common goal and a whole lot of persistence, you can accomplish just about anything. I would recommend this book to any woman, anyone that's interested in Central and Eastern European history, and anyone that's just interested in gender. This concludes my video. I want to thank you so much for listening and watching, and I hope I changed your worldview today, even if it was just a little bit. Again, thank you so much for listening.